Good morning, or I guess by Limerick time, good afternoon. I want to start by thanking CSSI for making this award. I must say, when Barbara Gray called me, I was quite startled, but also very pleased, and I thank you very much for the recognition. In thinking about this keynote, I talked to Barbara and to Sandra Waddick about their experiences and what might be of interest to this community. And they suggested that I talk about my experiences with partnerships and whatever I might have learned about power and scaling up in doing them. And also, so I'm going to do that. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about the social context in which I did this work and how it seems to me the world is changing and what's going to face those of you who continue to do this work in the 20s and 30s. So what I'd like to do is tell you about three different projects in the period between 1970 and 2010. And for each of them, talk a little bit about what power and scaling up meant in those contexts, and then focus on how the world is changing. So the first project is Leadership Cleveland. And at the time, I was a young professor at Case Western Reserve in Cleveland. And the city of Cleveland in the 70s was facing a lot of problems. There were racial tensions and had been riots in the late 60s and early 70s. There's a lot of labor management conflict and a lot of conflict between the business and the city. And the city had been in an industrial center whose major industries had moved often to the south or to other countries. So the manufacturing exodus created an economic crisis, and in 1977, the city defaulted on its loan payments, the first major city in the US to do that since the Depression. So the goal of this initiative was really to catalyze joint problem solving across the different sectors and different groups in the city. And the design of the program, let me just show you a slide that portrays who these different players were. The design of the program brought together 50 of the next generation leaders. These are people who were sort of seen as being the senior leaders in the next decade of various institutions in the city. And 50 of them came together over the course of a year for a program that would give them a sense of what was going on in the city at large and what the challenges were. And the design involved a 3-day startup retreat, and then for 9 months, 1 day, a day-long program that was designed by a committee of the participants to focus on a key problem in the city. So for example, the day that focused on law enforcement began the night before with all the participants riding around in police cars, seeing what kinds of challenges the police faced in the city. And then at the end of those 9 months, there was a second 3-day retreat to assess what people had learned and to think about what the future should bring and what should happen with the next class. And there were 3 different classes of Leadership Cleveland. So 150 next generation leaders took place over the course of the 3 years. And the outcomes of this, I think, were clear that people got a sense of the problems as seen by various constituencies. They expanded their connections with different participants. Our research in the kind of development of networks in the city suggested that there were an increased number of people engaged across racial and sectoral boundaries as a consequence of participating in Leadership Cleveland. And in 15 years later, in 1986, Jim Austin and his team from Harvard came and did a series of cases called the Cleveland Turnaround, which looked at how the city had responded to the challenges of the 70s. And one of the things they identified as an important factor in this turnaround was the existence of Leadership Cleveland and the networks that got built as a consequence. So to turn now briefly to the power and scale issues. Among other things, one of the things that made a difference in the sort of power balancing across the different constituencies in Leadership Cleveland was building shared diagnoses of the problems, which allowed people to see how the costs were also being shared and how it might be possible to have really effective action by cooperation among different sectors. Second factor was stereotypes of people in other sectors got defused by the experience of working with them. So for example, one of the senior corporate executives that sponsored the program said to me that in his organization, a lot of leadership thought that anybody who was any good in the nonprofit sector would move over into the for-profit sector. So they were a bit astonished to learn that some of the nonprofit leaders that participated in Leadership Cleveland were in fact pretty good. Third thing was the development of informal alliances among the new leaders that then led to credibility with their organizations. So they were able to vouch for people from other sectors and other constituencies as being worth engaging with. And as Leadership Cleveland progressed, and as several classes went through, it became known as, quotes, a good experience among many of the people there. And as a consequence, had more of a credible voice with the wider community. I think in terms of scaling up, the interpersonal links and trust among participants became more cooperation among their organizations as a consequence. And Leadership Cleveland, as a microcosm of the differences within the city, often replicated its conflicts and misunderstandings, but also catalyzed learning and change as a consequence. And one of the things we concluded about the experience was that it amounted to a micro intervention for macro problems, that it was a kind of socio-political judo that mobilized energies that otherwise could not have been focused on the issues that they focused on. So let me transition to a second project. In the 80s and 90s, I got involved in a series of studies of local development partnerships in the developing world. And they focused on the issue of, can cross-sector partnerships promote local development that would not otherwise happen? So our goals were to identify successful local development partnerships in countries in Africa and Asia, and try and figure out what elements were key to their success. And then let me show you a list of here are the partnership cases. Now the actual team that did the work involved the Synergos Institute in New York, the Society for Participatory Research in Asia in New Delhi, the African Association for Literacy and Adult Education in Nairobi, and the Institute for Development Research in Boston. And that's where I was at the time. And we had sponsorship from organizations like the Rockefeller Foundation and UNDP and the Institute for Sustainable Development. Now, let me just give you a brief overview of one of these partnerships so you have a sense of what they're like. In the Pakistan Urban Sanitation Project, an NGO called the Orangi Pilot Project did a series of interviews with people living in the Orangi slum in Karachi, which has 1 million people living there. And one of the issues that there was a lot of agreement about among the slum dwellers is that they wanted more sanitation, more possibility of latrines, etc. So the Orangi Pilot Project worked with a few lanes, these are the sort of social units in the slum, to organize themselves to dig latrines and collector drains, and basically changed the lives of the people in those lanes. And that took off as an intervention. And so Orangi Pilot Project worked with hundreds of lane organizations, ultimately with 6,000 of them, to build 64,000 latrines and to use association of lane organizations to press the city council of Karachi to build collector drains and sewage processing plants. And the lane organizations that did the original digging of latrines and collector drains then went on to do a whole bunch of other projects like women's work centers or microcredit, et cetera. So it was an intervention that had a lot of legs. And as in the study as a whole, we first identified the cases by talking to NGOs and UNDP and the World Bank and so on. Then we had a workshop for case writers to look at their first drafts and to give them feedback about what needed to be in the next drafts. And then we had 2 regional case analysis workshops that looked at the Asian cases and the African cases to try and identify what was critical to success. And across those partnerships, we ended up saying, all right, success has 2 components. One is the program reach. And unqualified success or high success was reaching 100,000 people or more. Medium success was somewhere between 10,000 and 100,000. And the second criterion was the resources for sustainability. Who was committed to keeping these projects going? And if there was commitment across grassroots organizations and NGOs and government organizations, it was seen as a clear success. And then we looked at the 5 cases, which included the Orangi project, that got seen as a success by both criteria, and found that one of the things that characterized them was social capital in the form of local organizations or networks, and like the lane organizations in Karachi, and bridging relationships that allowed for trust and cooperation between the different sectors. And one of the key elements was that grassroots people could have a voice in key decisions, either because of their organization in grassroots organizations, like the lane organizations in Karachi, or because NGOs acted as trusted mediators to influence the powerful players on behalf of grassroots. So with the results of this study, we ended up doing a number of things to disseminate. So we wrote several papers for UNDP. We wrote an article for World Development that sort of captured the overall learning. We wrote a chapter in the USAID handbook on building partnerships, and in various ways tried to share with wider audiences the things that we found in the study. Now, power and scale in the development partnerships. One element was that the NGO mediators were key to brokering joint action across power differences where there were really extreme power differences. So having trusted third parties who could influence all the players was very important. Organizing grassroots actors created new resources. So there was no labor to do the latrine building until the lane organizations decided they wanted to do it. And new alliances emerged in some of these partnerships that empowered constituents as well as influenced outsiders. So the Association of Lane Organizations had political clout with the City Council of Karachi to organize new systems for processing the results of the latrines. In terms of scaling up, it was clear that in some cases, the NGOs, and in other cases, the grassroots organizations replicated the partnerships in other systems. So, for example, the lane organizations replicated themselves across 6,000 different lanes. Um, Alliances of grass organizations began to influence state actors, as in the Association of Lane Organizations. Key concepts got altered as a consequence of some of these partnerships. So, for example, in the Philippines case, the project started out as a World Bank redevelopment project, which was going to bulldoze a lot of slums in Manila. And because of grassroots action and resistance from the people who lived there, they changed the concept from redevelopment to renewal, where they used resources from the World Bank and the government to rebuild their shanties rather than have them leveled. And in some cases, the project helped international actors reshape their development strategy. So UNDP was much more interested in partnerships as a consequence of supporting this study. Now let me move on to the third project. This is the International NGO Accountability Charter. And it focused on the problem of building the legitimacy of international NGOs for influencing global policies and practices. And key actors were international advocacy NGOs, and later a wide variety of NGOs. So let me just shift to, here's a sort of graphic for the key organizations that started this off. And in essence, it came out of a workshop of the CEOs of these organizations and a few others to talk about international advocacy campaigns by civil society organizations that were trying to influence business and government around global problems. And the key actors at that discussion got interested in the problem of accountability and legitimacy. And they, in essence, said, all right, let's keep meeting. We've got a lot of things we want to talk about. But for our next meeting, Dave, why don't you and the Hauser Center put together a paper about the accountability and legitimacy for international NGOs. So at the 2004 meeting, we talked about that paper, and they created a CEO task force to explore process and standards for international advocacy NGOs. And in the next year, we came together and they had organized a draft of an accountability charter, and they had decided this should focus not just on international advocacy NGOs, but international NGOs in general. So this would include development NGOs and so on. And in 2005, they not only created the draft, they created an organization to implement the proposed standards. And in 2006, something like 11 major international NGOs signed the charter and held a press conference to publicize it. And a couple of years later, they worked with the Global Reporting Initiative, which was creating reporting standards for business and government organizations, to create similar standards for NGOs. And as of 2020, the organization, which is currently named Accountability Now, had 29 members working in 150 different countries. So this is a case where something that wasn't foreseen in the initial workshop blew up into a pretty major activity. And I think that sort of the initial power relations among the CEOs had to do with the performance and reputation of their IANGOs, the International Advocacy NGOs. But it also quickly became linked to the issues of accountability and legitimacy as people shared an understanding of how important that was for cross-sector influence in the international community. And they began to recognize their interdependence because if a few highly visible NGOs were not accountable, that damaged the reputation of everybody. So that also led to building shared influence strategies and transnational campaigns. And in terms of scaling up, I think that building the concept and the process and measures that were parallel to the government and business standards enhanced the credibility of the whole project with those constituencies. Having the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, build this concepts and standards increased their legitimacy with other players. And the general form of this activity increased the visibility of legitimacy and accountability in many other campaigns, like Publish What You Pay, which had roots in a lot of the earlier discussions in this series of workshops. So to come back to looking across the cases, they are in many ways quite different. Leadership Cleveland was worried about a single city, and basically the critical ingredient was interpersonal networks for problem solving. The partnerships covered 2 continents and were all kinds of different issues and lots of different local issues. But some patterns emerged that really were transcended the regions and the differences. But those were basically among civil society and local organizations of business and government. Then the INGO Charter was really not cross-sector in the common sense of business, civil society, and government, but cross-issue in the sense that the NGOs involved were working in lots of different areas, and they were concerned about their ability to influence those other sectors. So themes of power balancing across the projects. One is that trusted mediators really were important to enabling participation and managing conflicts and balancing power. Shared problems and joint analysis enable people to have mutual influence and build new concepts. Action plans that built social capital and that they were allowed for learning from experience were very important. And the participant and credibility in the organization really have a lot of impact on how much external leverage the partnership was able to mobilize. In terms of scaling up, these projects often served as microcosms that allowed learning and organizing relevant to larger problems. Learning from pilot successes were a key basis for scaling them up. I mean, I think the Lane organizations is a dramatic example. The new organizations that were critical to enabling the scaling up pilots. So the creation of the NGO charter, the INGO charter, was a critical organization to making it happen for many wider communities. And finally, the choice of sponsors and participants often provided the basis for scaling up impacts. So the fact that UNDP was a sponsor of the Local Development Partnerships project then led them to move those ideas to a much wider base. Now, let me move on to the world is changing. You see here 2 columns. The first column is the source is me. I just thought about what are some of the factors that had an impact on the world when I was trying to do these partnerships. And the second column is a direct steal from the National Intelligence Council paper on global trends, Paradox of Progress in 2017. They, every 4 years, do not a forecast, but a suggestion of what are the key issues that are going to emerge in the next 20 or 30 years. So in the time I was doing these projects, the end of the Cold War, growing globalization, growth in productivity and shrinkage of poverty, the information revolution and the concentration in wealth and the rise of civil society, all made cross-sector partnerships in many ways not easy, but the world is ready for them. And it's not so clear that the world is going to be as friendly to these partnerships in the next 40 to 20 to 30 years. The wealthy countries are aging, and these are factors that were identified in this report. The wealthy countries are aging and poor countries are very young. Globally, economic growth is probably going to be weak. Technology is going to catalyze change and divisiveness. Tribalism and nationalism is going to encourage exclusion. Governance is challenged by flat revenues and polarization. There is conflict among major partners and from terrorists and from weak states and from disruptive technologies. Climate and health are climate change and health like pandemics are going to build walls or increase conflict. These are all factors that may make life complicated for people who are trying to promote partnerships. Now, this report sort of identified these trends, and then it said, we're going to propose 3 scenarios for understanding the next 25 to 30 years. And we're not taking a statement that any of these is necessarily going to happen, but they are alternative lenses through which to look at what the possibilities are. And the 3 lenses look like this. The islands lens basically says we're going to have more wall building around nations, more national protectionism and slow growth in a pushback against globalization. That's going to increase internal focus, and climate change and pandemics are going to reduce resources and create strategies. The culture and value differences across national boundaries are going to take on more importance. So it's going to be a time of nationalism and tribalism and refugees and terrorism with people building walls around that. And that suggests that partnerships may end up focusing much more on identities or reduced resources or culture and value differences. A second scenario has to do with what they call orbits. And basically this reflects regional spheres of influence and power centers like the US or the European Union, or China, or Russia. And as regional spheres of influence sort of become important, there may be a lot more consolidation and solidarity within regions than across them. There may be, for instance, climate management changes within regions that have impacts outside of regions and so lead to tension that way. Basically, for partnerships in the orbit scenario, it may be within region partnerships are more easy, but it may well be that cross-region partnerships are critically important to maintaining the world as we want it to be. The third scenario is one they called communities, which reflects networks at a lot of different levels. And this scenario proposes that local networks will become key problem solvers, and may be much larger than local given the improvements in information and communications technology. Civil society may become key problem solvers in the absence of states being active about solving problems. So multi-stakeholder networks may drive a lot of change, and that building partnerships may be central to decentralized governments and to solving key problems that governments are not able to deal with. In any case, the future for cross-sector initiatives, it seems to me, is going to face more challenges, value tensions and social identities and nationalism and polarization. It's going to have to continue to cope with disruptive technologies and individuals, and the resource challenges are likely to increase from epidemics and environmental declines and multi-level conflicts. The arenas in which these CSIs emerge may also vary. I think this is the scenarios I've just talked about. So national islands retreating from global challenges, or regional orbits and spheres of influence being the base, or local and transnational network communities. The stakes and payoffs for effective civil society and cross-sector initiatives, it seems to me, are going to escalate. So while I don't think it's going to get easier to make cross-sector initiatives happen, I think it may well be that the payoffs are increasingly important. And so I wish you lots of luck. Thank you.